He couldn't remember exactly when the habit began, only that it had been there for a long time, long enough to become woven into the fabric of everyday life. Each morning started with the promise that today would be different, and each night ended with a familiar weight of disappointment. He tried discipline. He made plans. He set strict rules for himself. There were periods when his determination felt unshakable, when he cut the habit out completely and endured the first few days on pure willpower alone. But then, like an invisible cord pulling him back, he always returned to the same place. He tried modern methods too. He read books, listened to podcasts, and followed experts who spoke confidently about willpower and iron discipline. At times, it felt like progress, as if one more push, one more effort would finally be enough. But the harder he tried, the stronger the resistance inside him became. The habit didn't disappear. It simply hid, waiting for the moment when he was more tired, more worn down, and then it returned with twice the force. Slowly, exhaustion began to arrive even before the habit itself. Not just the tiredness of failing again, but the deeper fatigue of constantly fighting himself. Then came shame. He didn't talk about it with anyone, because from the outside, this was something anyone should be able to control. And finally, doubt. Maybe I'm weak. Maybe I lack discipline. Maybe there's something wrong with me at a deeper level. On a business trip, he met an older Japanese man, not a famous teacher, no lecture, no advice. They simply sat together in silence for a long while. When he casually mentioned his struggle, the man smiled softly and said almost in a whisper, "Perhaps you are not losing because you are weak. Perhaps you are losing because you are trying to control in the wrong way." The words didn't solve anything right away, but they stayed with him. And for the first time in many years, he wondered if the problem wasn't who he was, but how he had been trying to change himself. Later, when he looked back, he realized he was not alone in trying this way. Most of us are taught the same lesson from the beginning. If you want to change, you need to be stronger. Tighten your discipline. Use willpower to overpower yourself. When a habit doesn't disappear, the conclusion feels simple and familiar. We just weren't determined enough. This way of thinking shows up everywhere quietly and normally. At the start of every year, gyms are packed. Everyone carries a new image of themselves and an ambitious plan. A few weeks pass and the crowd begins to thin. Not because people don't want to change, but because that change is built on tension and force. When we want to escape social media, we delete the apps in a decisive moment, almost like declaring war. Then a few days later, on a tired evening, the apps are downloaded again. Not because we are weak, but because we placed ourselves in direct opposition to an inner need we never fully understood. Even the phrase, "this is the last time," carries the same energy. It sounds like hope, but underneath it is pressure. A promise made in a state of tension often creates nothing but another chain. And when that promise is broken, the familiar feelings return: disappointment, then self-blame, and then reaching for the very habit that once provided relief. This cycle unfolds quietly. Force creates resistance. Resistance leads to repetition. Repetition brings shame, and shame pushes us back into the old habit. No one wins this battle because both sides are the same person. What's easy to miss is that no one is trying to do the wrong thing. This mindset is built from a genuine desire to be better, faster, stronger. It has helped people achieve remarkable things in the outer world. But when applied to inner life, the same logic begins to work against us. There is a quiet truth that few people notice: what we fight tends to persist. Not because it is powerful, but because it is being fed by attention and tension. What you fight, you keep alive. And perhaps before learning how to change, the first step is to pause and observe how we have been fighting ourselves all along. In Japanese culture, the way habits are understood moves in a very different direction. There is no language of battle, no idea that a part of a person must be destroyed or eliminated. Habits are not seen as enemies, and they are not treated as personal flaws. They are simply responses, traces left behind from a time when they once served a purpose. From this perspective, no one is born with bad habits. Habits form as quiet solutions. When stress appears, the body looks for relief. When emptiness lingers, the mind searches for something to fill it. When emotions become too heavy, we look for an exit. Many habits are born in those exact moments. Smoking does not begin with destruction. It begins with a sense of relief, a pause in the pressure, a breath that slows down. Social media addiction does not start with laziness. It begins as a way to escape boredom, loneliness, or the feeling of being left behind. Every behavior once acted like a small lifeboat, helping us stay afloat during a certain chapter of life. Seen this way, habits are no longer something to hate. They become signals, messages the body and mind are trying to send. Habit is not the problem. Habit is the message. And like any message, if it is not listened to, it will continue to repeat itself, growing louder each time. The Japanese rarely ask, "How do I get rid of this habit?" Instead, they ask, "What caused this habit to appear?" That question opens a completely different space, a space of curiosity rather than judgment, of observation rather than control. At the center of this way of seeing is the idea of impermanence. Everything comes and goes. Emotions do not stay forever. Desires are not permanent. Even the strongest urges are only temporary waves. But when we fight them, we unknowingly extend their life. When we fear them, we give them more weight. Rather than suppressing, the Japanese learn to observe. Like sitting beside a warm teapot watching steam rise and then disappear. No need to interfere. No need to push anything away. Just awareness. In this light, habits become quiet teachers. They point to where we are lacking, where we are wounded, where we are living out of rhythm with our natural state. And when something is seen clearly, it begins to change on its own. Not because it is forced, but because it has fulfilled its role. Perhaps the hardest part is not letting go of a habit, but learning to listen to it long enough to understand what it has been trying to say. There is a story passed down in a small monastery in Japan, not as a lesson, but as a gentle reminder. A young monk was often swept away by anger. Not great bursts of rage, but small accumulations. A student who wasn't paying attention, a morning that felt louder than usual, something not unfolding the way it should. Day after day, these minor moments stacked on top of one another until he finally exploded. He felt ashamed of it. He believed he wasn't calm enough, not disciplined enough in his practice. And like many people in that position, he tried to fix himself by doing more. Sitting in meditation longer, forcing himself into silence, repeating reminders about peace and composure. But the more he tried to control his anger, the sooner it appeared, and the stronger it became, as if it were resisting confinement. One day he went to an older monk and confessed his frustration and helplessness. The elder offered no advice. He only asked, "When anger arises, do you know where it lives in your body?" The question confused the young monk. He had never considered it before. From that day on, whenever anger appeared, he didn't try to push it away. He simply observed it. He noticed his breath becoming shallow, heat rising in his chest, his jaws tightening, thoughts repeating themselves about how things should be different. He didn't correct them. He didn't label them as wrong. He simply noted them quietly. Something unexpected happened after a few weeks. The anger didn't vanish, but it no longer consumed him. A small space appeared between the feeling and his reaction. Within that space, he could feel anger without being controlled by it. And then, like a cloud passing across a summer sky, the anger dissolved more quickly than he had ever imagined. This is the core practice of the Japanese approach. Not fixing emotions, but staying with them. Not controlling urges, but allowing them to exist long enough to pass on their own. Urges or cravings move as much as anger does. They arrive like a wave, small at first, then rising, and if they are not resisted, they naturally recede. A man in Tokyo used this same approach when he quit smoking after more than 20 years. He didn't throw his cigarettes away. He didn't avoid familiar situations. When the craving came, he sat down, held a cigarette in his hand, breathed in its familiar scent, and observed. He noticed the restlessness in his stomach, the slight tension in his shoulders, the thoughts whispering just one more time. He did nothing else. He didn't smoke. He didn't reason with himself. He didn't distract his attention. He simply stayed with the sensation, like sitting beside an anxious friend. He noticed the craving peak quickly and then began to soften, sometimes within minutes, sometimes longer. But it always passed. This experience completely changed the way he saw himself. The craving was no longer a command. It was just a phenomenon, a temporary movement in the body and the mind. And within that realization, something deeper emerged. He was not craving. He was the space in which the craving appeared and disappeared. When we stop identifying ourselves with our urges, their power naturally weakens, not because we defeat them, but because we no longer participate in the battle. And in that absence of resistance, a very quiet kind of freedom begins to take shape. When urges are no longer treated as enemies, and when we learn to stay with them long enough to watch them dissolve on their own, a natural question arises. If we don't fight, if we don't force, then where does real change actually come from? The Japanese don't answer this with a single technique. They speak instead of a flow, a way of living that moves very slowly but with great steadiness. The first pillar of that flow is called Kaizen. It sounds small, and it truly is. Kaizen does not demand dramatic turning points. It asks only for something modest, extremely small change, so small that the nervous system barely notices it. In the West, we often believe change only matters if it is big enough to impress, but the human brain doesn't work that way. Changes that are too strong tend to trigger self-protection. The body senses danger and does everything it can to return to what feels familiar. Someone I knew used to watch television for 4 hours every night, not because he loved the shows, but because they helped him forget a long day. He didn't try to quit all at once. He simply watched 5 minutes less each evening, just 5 minutes. Not a heroic decision, almost insignificant. And precisely because it felt insignificant, it didn't create resistance. 5 minutes became 10, then 20. The old path wasn't destroyed. It was simply used less and less. The second pillar reaches deeper, Ikigai. Not as a grand life purpose, but as a quiet sense of why we do what we do. Many habits remain because they fill an empty space. When that space is still there, removing the habit only creates an uncomfortable silence. And inside that silence, the old habit often returns. A programmer once drank alcohol every evening after work, not because he craved the taste, but because he needed a ritual to shift from work life to personal life. When he realized this, he didn't focus on quitting alcohol. He created a different ritual, changing clothes, making tea, sitting down to sketch for 10 minutes, something that had brought him pure joy as a child. Gradually, the new ritual met the same need without harming him. Alcohol lost its role not because it was forbidden, but because it was no longer necessary. The third pillar is inseparable from the first two. Replacement. Not replacement by command, but by natural growth. The Japanese understand that you cannot create a vacuum in the human mind without consequences. If a habit is removed without something new being nourished, the mind will look for its way back to the old path. They use a simple image. Habits are like paths in a forest. The old path is clear because it has been walked thousands of times. The new path is difficult at first. Tall grass, uneven ground. But each time you walk, it becomes a little easier. There is no need to destroy the old path. Only enough patience to walk the new one long enough. Kaizen makes the first step gentle. Ikigai gives a reason to keep walking. And replacement happens naturally when the new path begins to feel more alive than the old one. There is no moment of victory, no declaration of change. Just one day when you realize you no longer return to that familiar trail. And when you look back, you see that you didn't abandon a habit. You outgrew it. As the new path begins to take shape, the last thing that needs to be released is not a habit, but an old way of seeing yourself. Many people carry a quiet belief that they need to fix themselves, that something deep inside is broken. And each failure becomes further proof that this belief must be true. In Western culture, shame is often used as motivation. We criticize ourselves, apply pressure, hoping that harshness will push us forward. But shame rarely creates lasting change. It only creates an inner conflict. One part of us becomes the judge while another becomes the rebel. These two parts drain each other, leaving very little energy for living or growing. The Japanese see this differently. They do not believe a person must be defeated to become better. They believe real change can only happen when the inner war ends. When we stop treating ourselves like a project that needs fixing and begin treating ourselves like a living being, learning how to grow. Self-compassion is not indulgence. It is not avoiding responsibility. It is the ability to look directly at what happened without adding stories of self-blame. When a habit returns, instead of saying, "I'm terrible," we note this is happening. In that moment, there is honesty without violence. You do not need to defeat yourself to change. You do not need to prove that you are strong enough. You only need to understand what led you here, to outgrow the old solutions that once helped you survive, and to move slowly enough for your nervous system to feel safe as you step into a different rhythm of life. Change that occurs in this manner is subtle. There is no dramatic breakthrough. It is like the morning mist slowly dissolving as the sun rises. You don't notice the exact moment it disappears. You only realize that the air feels lighter. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: the habit you are trying to escape may never have been your enemy. It may simply be a part of you that has gone unheard for too long, quietly waiting to be understood.